The White House is the headquarters of the most powerful nation on earth, home and place of work of the most influential leader in the world. An iconic building standing majestic at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. It has been drawn, painted, photographed and filmed millions of times by millions of visitors every year. But who designed it and what was their inspiration? The man who designed and supervised the construction of the President's House, later called the White House, was a young immigrant architect from Ireland called James Hoban. Born in 1755, Hoban's legacy as a visionary creator endures through his greatest masterpiece. The White House has stood the test of time and is still very much fit for purpose. This is a testament to the foresight and attention to detail of all involved in its conception, design and construction, most notably George Washington and James Hoban. In addition to his work in the White House, he also was involved in the supervision of the construction of the Capitol building. He built the first church in D.C., and he founded and headed the first Masonic Lodge. This is his story from humble beginnings as a son of a tenant farmer in Ireland to designing one of the most iconic buildings in the world. James Hoban was born to Edward and Martha. Edward was a tenant farmer and labourer on the desert estate owned by the Cuff family. The desert estate was located between Callan and Cuffstown, County Kilkenny in Ireland. At the heart of the estate was a magnificent country house called Desert Court. Construction on Desert Court was completed some 20-odd years before James was born. The grand house must have been a tremendous source of wonderment and inspiration to young James, and that may have sown the seeds of his lifelong dedication to designing and constructing stone public buildings. The house was built in the Paladine architectural style, quite similar to the White House in shape and symmetry. Desert Court was described as one of the finest houses in Leinster. It was deliberately destroyed by fire in 1923, but rebuilt and subsequently demolished completely in 1957. The Hoban family home survived up until the 1940s, but I don't believe there are any Hobans living in the Callan area at present. In his hometown of Callan today, there is a monument featuring Hoban's life story on 4 plaques, plus a profile portrait of Hoban. On the ground beneath the humble monument is an image of the White House etched into the stone pavement. There are 2 stone benches where people can come and sit and rest near the monument. There is also an installation near where Hoban's home once stood, dedicated to the architect. James Hoban served an apprenticeship at Desert Court as a wheelwright and carpenter before securing a place at the Dublin Society School and leaving Kilkenny. James received an advanced student position at the Dublin Society School for Drawing in 1779. The school was located on Grafton Street at the time, and because James was coming from a trades background, he would have received free tuition. The head of the school was a man called Thomas Ivory, who was a renowned architect and, like James, came from a carpentry background. James seems to have excelled at school and even won a Duke of Leinster prize for one of his drawings. He was given a choice between money or a medal. He chose the medal as he felt that would be more helpful to him in the future. While he was studying in Dublin, he worked on 3 buildings which are still around to this day. Newcomen Bank, which is now a council office, was designed by Thomas Ivory. The Royal Exchange, which is now City Hall, was designed by Thomas Cooley, and the Customs House, which was designed by James Gandon. All these buildings are civic or government buildings that have lasted a very long time, and all were designed by people that would have influenced James greatly. But one building seems to have inspired James more than any other, and that building is Leinster House, former home of the Dukes of Leinster and current home of the Oireachtas, the Irish Parliament. A lot of the great architecture we see in Dublin today would have been built around the time James Hoban was doing his studies. James had achieved a lot by 1785, and maybe he felt that his background prevented him from reaching his full potential. Whatever the reason, he decided to leave Dublin and head for the United States of America. James first arrived in Philadelphia, which was then the nation's temporary capital. In Philadelphia, he would come in contact with many of the aspiring politicians of the time. One such politician was fellow Irishman Pierce Butler. Butler, as an American founding father, may have been a great help to Hoban in his career advancement. James then moved to Charleston, where he started a business partnership with Pierce Purcell, who was also Irish and may actually have been a cousin of Hoban's. He also seems to be surrounded by other members of his family in Charleston at that time. One of the buildings James worked on in Charleston was the county courthouse, a beautiful stone building that is still in use today. The Leinster House influence is unmistakable with this building. President George Washington decided that they needed a special place for future leaders to live and work. Therefore, he asked Thomas Jefferson to launch a competition to find the best design for the executive mansion. James Hoban, with his simple yet elegant style, won the competition and thus secured his place in history. He even beat Thomas Jefferson, who had also entered a design. Hoban had met George Washington the previous year in Charleston and seems to have made a good impression on the politician, even though the president couldn't remember his name. Construction began in 1792 and took 8 years to complete. The cornerstone was lifted into place on the 13th of October 1792, but according to the White House Historical Association, George Washington was not in attendance. Nobody is quite sure to this day where that stone is located within the building, even after many restorations have been carried out over the years. The President's house was not meant to be a king's palace or the home of a totalitarian ruler. It was meant to belong to the people and a place where a citizen as president could work and live for a set period of time. With this in mind, George Washington wanted a stone house to be on par with the state buildings of Europe, to project statesmanship and confidence, but not extravagance. The house was to be built in a new city called the Federal City, later called Washington, D.C. The Federal City was also where all the other buildings needed to run the federal government would be built, including the Capitol building. The time frame for this ambitious project was just 10 years. The competition for labour and materials must have been enormous. This makes the fact that the White House has lasted so well even more impressive. The White House was built by European immigrants and free and enslaved African American workers, with the wages of the slaves going to their owners. Hoban himself owned 4 slaves working as carpenters with him on the White House. Their names were Peter, Ben, Daniel and Harry. Hoban leased these enslaved workers to the government. They did receive some wages, but not as much as white workers. 9 of the first 12 American presidents had enslaved people working for them on the construction of the White House. These enslaved workers were leased to the central government. Though masons came from Scotland to work on the White House, these men were effectively exiles from their own country because they were not supposed to leave Britain at the time because they were at war with France. The stone used in the White House was an Aquia sandstone from Virginia, very similar to what the Scottish stone cutters would have been familiar with. Both George Washington and James Hoban were members of the Freemasons. This fact may have given James the authority to manage the project more smoothly and efficiently. In 1814, the British burned down the White House as well as much of Washington. This was in retaliation for attacks on what is now modern-day Toronto. The British were led by another Irishman called Robert Ross. The scorch marks can still be seen today on some unpainted walls at the White House. James Hoban oversaw the rebuilding works, which lasted 3 years. James also did the design for the south portico of the White House in 1818, and it was built in 1824. The north portico was completed in 1830, and again James Hoban was asked to design and supervise the work. Harry Truman did major restoration work on the internal structure of the White House between 1949 and 1952. Care was taken not to impact the facade of the main house, which still looks much the same as it did in Hoban's time. Another architect who had a significant impact on the early years of the White House was Benjamin Henry Latrobe. He worked on the White House for Thomas Jefferson in 1801 and also helped on the restoration work after the fire in 1814, as well as the north and south porticos when they were being constructed. James Hoban was married to Suzanne Sewell and had 10 children, including James Jr., a district attorney for Washington. He was a local politician and strongly involved in the Catholic Church in the US. He died in Washington on the 8th of December 1831 and is buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery. He died a wealthy man with his place in history assured forever.